Hello everybody, here's Sandra Kearney and Susan Marsden sitting outside, and this time we're doing the Marsden Szwarcbord Foundation's Make History at Home series. We're continuing, and it's session 6, which is we are outside and we are talking about hearth and garden histories.
And many of you are probably researching your house. You may live in a heritage house, you may live in a heritage location, and you may also have created your own history in the garden or inherited a garden that has a long history to it. And we thought it would be a really good idea to give you some tips on how to go about creating this record. And another thing that came to mind was that in 2020 the UNESCO highlighted the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on World Heritage, and they've actually launched #ShareOurHeritage campaign to promote access to culture. And in some ways that is the culture of your garden and the culture of your house.
That's very true, actually. And I think the other thing to say is, again, as we've said in earlier parts of this series, before you start cold, if you like, researching the history of your house or of your garden or of a place you're interested in, have a stop and think about who else might have written about it or reported it. And you will find there's this incredible richness of material. There may be as simple as I'm waving away the mozzies, which are an essential accompaniment to an Australian garden. You have heritage lists for a start, and in most countries now, and we've just mentioned UNESCO at World Heritage level, you have formal heritage processes. So your place may actually already be heritage listed at local level or has been recorded by the National Trust. So they're all places to look at. You will certainly need to do some reading about the kinds of architecture that you're interested in and the kinds of gardens that you're interested in, and we'll talk about some sources about that later. There's lots of good guides with that. You can look up online heritage databases. You can also read local histories, because some of the fundamental mistakes sometimes, and my sister and I laughed about this once when we were doing heritage work together. We talked to someone in an old suburb who told us, I've worked out when this house was built because I've worked back through all the owners, knowing all the dates, and I've come up with the date of 1836. And we kept a very straight face and muttered to each other afterwards, that would make that internationally significant because Adelaide, the city itself, wasn't surveyed and sold until 1837, and the suburb that we were in, which was Highmarsh, wasn't surveyed until 1838. So Australia especially is blessed with a whole series of records that we can mention later, and a lot of local histories. And so I think that's another very important thing to look at.
Yeah.
And then, and Sandra will say this, you can start exploring and recording your own place.
Yes, you can. And you can ask older neighbours, and you can even ask previous owners about the history of the house where you live. And you may find that some of your documents actually hold a key to the history. Or in the case of Kate Llewellyn, who wrote a beautiful book, A Fig at the Gate, it was her third garden, and she had previously gardened in the Blue Mountains, came to Adelaide and started to garden by the sea. And she records a history of her community within this book, although she's talking about the development of a garden. But it's all the people she came into contact with. It's the people she shared her herbs with, her duck eggs. And it's there's all sorts of ways that you can actually go about it. But the thing is to start in your community, start local, go to your local society or your local history centre and ask questions and start to, as we said in session 1 of this series, make a table, get a soft pencil, mark the back of photographs, write up notes, begin very slowly, don't feel overwhelmed, and just start making notes about things that you do know.
And Sandra we've already posted some examples of keeping an actual quite formal record of a creation of a garden. Sandra kept a beautiful record of garden.
Yeah, that was a garden, my first garden ever in Dublin, and it was over a number of years, and I just took photographs because I wanted to record the work I was doing. And it was only when I sold that house and garden and moved south, and I looked back on it, that I realised I'd kept a history.
Yes.
and that garden's gone now, sadly. But at least I have a record, a photographic record, and I have dates, I have plant lists. And it was more part of the fun, and for me as a historian, it just felt natural to keep that record. And I think if you go through your photo albums, or you go back through, maybe some of you keep diaries and you go back through them, you will find that you have actually kept a record of things you were doing in the garden.
In fact, I've just written, from those records, I've just written an essay called Notes from a Global Warming Garden, which we're all having to deal with and adapt to. I, for example, apart from that, I've actually kept what I call my bonsai book, which is wrapped with wrapping paper from the Tokyo fish market. And because Tokyo,
it tells a story.
It does tell a story in itself. Yeah. But what I kept this is because on one side I write down when we actually got the bonsai or started the bonsai, and on the other side, back to front, I keep a record of when we pruned them. So, and this way, this made us all prune them recently, because we realised to my horror when I found this book, I lost it for a while, that we hadn't done them for 4 years. The other thing to say is, as sources, very useful sources, are your real estate ads. Yeah. And one of my brothers has just, advertised his house for sale in a very modest house in sort of middle suburbs of Adelaide. This house that we're living in, not only have I kept the real estate ad from when we bought it, 2005, but in fact, one of the local historians dropped in one day and actually gave me their record of the real estate ads for this house, because it's an interesting.
But they actually go, how far did they go back?
Back to the 1980s.
Yeah.
And so, which would actually span the period before renovation and then after, and then we've renovated again or extended. So it's had several phases as modern reconstruction.
But they actually have wonderful, each ad has a little image.
Yes, that's
so
right.
In a way you've recorded how the house has changed shape and how it has developed.
And you can, we will talk about then, so that's recording. So we're talking not that you've done your background contextual research, and it's exactly what you do in a heritage study. You do your background contextual histories research, all that kind of stuff, you find out all that general stuff. Then you do your field work, which is recording the actual places, as in a documentary, oral history, and visual, and sketches and maps as well. And then thirdly, you go back to the desk, and you do your associated actual solid research in archives and what have you, which we might talk about in a minute. But part of that is you don't have to necessarily write a lot, and this again is an example of just a pictorial book, photo book I put together of a garden history tour we did with my mother and her old friend and my sister back in 2013 in the wonderful Southern Highlands of New South Wales. Yes. The other thing to say is, again, as sources of information, a very important one is actually two. One is the National Trust, and even on the cover here is a garden that actually I have visited on a garden history tour, which is the restored colonial garden at Goulburn, the Riversdale Homestead, wonderful, run by volunteers. And secondly is the Australian Garden History Society. Yes, you can combine two interests, history and gardens, as both of us do. And they have wonderful conferences, terrific journals.
But then they also have on the back oral history.
They do. Every issue, and you can link to that oral history collection. But they also do have a guide on how to record one.
They do have a guide, and it's really good, and it helps you to map out your garden and work out how to just sketch it and how to detail it and how to take oral histories of the garden as well, which you wouldn't necessarily associate with a garden, but you can take oral histories of people who have worked in it in the past or those that are even working in it now. And we will give a link to that. It's a pretty good guide.
We'll probably go inside soon, but one more thing to say. I was struck, I was going to meet a friend for a walk through our own botanic gardens And I often find myself now noting a plant that I didn't know the name of in a botanic garden, which has handy labels.
Yes, take
and
a
photographing
photograph.
it. Yes,
Yeah.
and so that's another way, keeping plant lists and learning the names. We're very lucky here in South Australia. It's very hot and dry, but it has this, actually all you need is water and some protection from the sun. We can grow almost anything.
Yeah.
And Sandra living in the hills, so she has a colder climate. So we do span it, and we have this amazing cornucopia of native plants, indigenous plants and native generally, and then plants from the southern hemisphere, the particularly South African plants. And I've just been to South Africa, which was a wonderful experience to see in the wild, so to speak, many of the very popular garden plants. We were talking about the plants and in our garden, and you might have noticed some orchids behind us. There's a story attached to some of those orchids, and my husband and co-founder of Marsden Szwarcbord Foundation, Michael Szwarcbord, will talk in a minute on the video. He's actually telling the story of his grandfather, Georg Molkentin, who migrated to Australia and was given residency in 1938. That's his formal permit to remain in Australia. And we've posted these images and a bit of that story to Facebook as well. Now over to Michael.
Michael has an orchid that has been passed down through his family, so he's just going to tell us a little bit about it. So Michael, how long do you have it?
I've had it now for at least 40 years.
And where did you get it from?
And I got it from my mother, and she got it from her father, Georg Molkentin. Georg came to Australia in 1938, and in around 1950 moved to Melbourne, and was always a keen gardener.
Yeah.
He had a wonderful vegetable garden and lots of fruit trees. And this is probably the last of his orchids. He loved Cymbidium orchids. Unfortunately, I've been pretty poor at caring for them. This is the last surviving one, so I've got to really take special care of
So
this.
it's a real family treasure then that has been passed down through the years.
It is,
And
yes.
it has great memories of somebody.
It does. I still remember his orchids sitting on the windowsill inside his house, and he'd bring them in winter and just have them on display. It's beautiful.
Yeah, well thank you for sharing.
We asked actually Judith Brown, who's a distant relative of mine, who has written a number of histories herself and still researching in her 90s. She's written a lovely book called The Almonds of Walkerville. Here it is. Here's a lovely sketch of the house, the very old Adelaide house, by Bill Wall, when they owned it, when the Brown family owned it. Here's Judith with some of the books to which she's contributed. We talked with her today. What do you usually say to people? Write it down.
Write it down before you die, because nobody's interested until the primary source has gone. And then they start, why didn't I listen to Grandma? Why didn't I ask Mum? And it's too late.